On November 15, 2013, Chris called 911. He said he had arrived home and found his parents unresponsive in their truck. Chris said that Roger was coughing and that Melissa's head was bobbing up and down. He said they were alive but barely moving. The dispatcher asked Chris to put them on their backs to try to administer CPR. Roger and Melissa had both been shot in the right side of their heads. Melissa Blumel died the next day, and Roger Blumel died about 5 weeks later. Roger Blumel was born on January 17, 1965, into a household bustling with many members, including his parents and 7 children, 6 boys and a girl. Roger's family was not only large but also very united, raised with a strong sense of values and community life. Even while still in high school, Roger proved to be a hard-working young man with goals for the future. He began driving his father's truck and, after graduating from the local high school, worked in concrete transportation. Later, he discovered that his true calling was in sales, a field in which he eventually found success. According to his friends, he was one of those people capable of selling ice to Eskimos. This skill was also accompanied by a generous, cheerful, and extroverted personality. He always seemed happy, and nothing pleased him more than making everyone around him have a big smile on their faces. Roger had a good life and an excellent relationship with his family. The only thing missing was a partner, and one day he achieved that too. The details are not specified, but a close friend later recounted that at the end of the evening when he met a young woman who captivated him, Roger declared with absolute resolution that she was the woman he was going to marry. The girl in question was named Melissa. She was born in Wichita on January 1, 1960. Her childhood, too, was spent in a loving family comprised of 3 girls and 3 boys, though a younger sister died before reaching her first birthday. Melissa was a sweet, hard-working girl, always ready to help not just her family but everyone around her. She began working as a cashier at a bank where she made a successful career. In the following years, her seriousness, commitment, and sense of collaboration earned her several promotions that led her to become the vice president of the bank. That first meeting marked the beginning of the union of 2 soulmates who married in 1991. Life for the Blumels seemed perfect as Melissa climbed the ranks within the bank, and Roger's charm led him to establish his own business. Roger loved to share time with friends and bring joy to everyone around him. In Melissa, he found the perfect companion. Moreover, both had a strong social consciousness that led them to collaborate and participate in any charitable, sports, or collective activity that took place in their community. However, as we've seen in almost all stories, a perfect life does not exist, and for the Blumels, the only thing missing was a child to bring laughter and joy to their loving home. Unfortunately, this desire remained elusive for the couple, and after years of unsuccessfully trying to conceive, Roger and Melissa began to consider the idea of adopting a child. With this intention, they contacted a local social worker. Their wishes were heard, and doubly so, as a woman named Keisha Schaberg had put up her 2 sons for adoption. Anthony, 7 years old, whom everyone called Tony, and Christopher, 4 years old, known as Chris. Keisha's idea was to place them in an open adoption so she could maintain contact with her sons and the family raising them. However, the Blumels did not consider this the best option, as they wanted to raise the children as their own and completely remove them from what had been a tough start in life. In the end, Roger and Melissa's approach prevailed, and from that moment, Tony and Chris formally became part of the Blumel family, starting to enjoy a life they never knew existed. In fact, it was later known that Tony was amazed he was allowed to have dinner every day. The children quickly adapted and began to enjoy their new life. They attended elementary school and successfully completed that stage as good students. In high school, they were also successful, had no problems with their peers, were fully integrated and made a wide group of friends, and excelled in sports, particularly in wrestling and football. Tony made rapid progress in wrestling, securing second place in a competition in his division. At that time, everything seemed to promise a bright future for the boys and a happy life for the whole family. But the Blumels' world began to turn upside down when Tony reached his senior year of high school. The young man began to change what had until then been exemplary behavior. He turned into someone who was constantly in conflict with his parents, accusing them of always favoring his younger brother Chris. From then on, he engaged in alcohol consumption, disregarded curfews, and even smoked marijuana. Things in the Blumel household became chaotic, and soon it seemed that the last hope for the young man to correct his path was lost. For a long time, Tony had expressed a fervent desire to join the United States Air Force after finishing high school. But this dream dissipated due to his own behavior when, in 2013, he was arrested for an unspecified act of aggression, and shortly after graduating, again for driving under the influence of alcohol. With these records, he could say goodbye to a future in military aviation. These events did not lead Tony to reflect. On the contrary, it plunged him into a downward spiral. Once he graduated from high school, his life had no direction. He did not want to continue studying, nor did he want to work. In fact, he wanted to do nothing more than sleep late and spend the rest of his day immersed in a cloud of cannabis smoke. Melissa lived in terror of the boy's outbursts of rage. And amidst all this situation, which was so difficult to bear, there was something else that the Blumels did not know. Since the spring of 2013, through social media, Keisha had been contacting her biological sons. While it seems Chris either rejected Keisha's friend request or was not very receptive to communicating with his biological mother, Tony not only accepted immediately, but was also completely excited to reconnect with his real mother. Keisha had been devastated after giving her sons to the Blumels. Although she was relieved to know that both had been welcomed into the same good family and would stay together, she could not resign herself to the lack of contact. Reconnecting with her eldest son filled Keisha with excitement, but at the same time she developed a great resentment towards the Blumels, believing that they had turned Chris against her. However, this feeling was undoubtedly overshadowed by the happiness of reconnecting with her firstborn. Additionally, the news of Tony's problems with his adoptive parents fueled Keisha's hope of reuniting with her son, and she wasted no time in offering him to come to see her. Meanwhile, at the adoptive family's home, far from improving, things were getting worse. The conflict reached a point of no return when one day, in the midst of one of his fits of rage, Tony punched a hole in a wall. This was the turning point for the Blumels. They could no longer risk their own safety and that of Chris. After several unsuccessful discussions trying to put an end to the eldest son's behaviors, Roger and Melissa came to the difficult decision to tell Tony that he had to leave the house. The young man initially wandered aimlessly but soon realized he had to do something to sustain himself, so he got some jobs at fast food restaurants and supplemented those meager earnings by selling cannabis. Although he slept like a nomad from night to night at some friends' houses, he ended up associating with a group of youths who were deeply involved in excessive drug use. And amid all these despairing events, a lifeline suddenly appeared for Tony when Keisha told him to come to California to live with her. Tony eagerly accepted the invitation, and the reunion took place in September 2013 at Keisha's house in California. The young man was accompanied by his best friend from high school, Braden, who had dropped out in his junior year to dedicate himself to drug dealing. The two young men were excited because they arrived with the hope of having Keisha's support, who was also versed in the drug trade, to start a large marijuana business in the area, and they even talked about entering the medical cannabis market. The reality was that the two young men had arrived to live in a small apartment which had only one room. It is not hard to imagine that the situation in the place began to be tense, particularly because Sean, Keisha's partner, had two jobs and was the only one bringing in money to cover the expenses for 5 people. Keisha only contributed a part of the social assistance she received for her daughter. Keisha, Tony, and Braden spent their days using drugs, and the woman's younger daughter was all the time under that bad influence. Logically, at one point things reached an unacceptable limit, something that happened when Sean found out that Tony and Braden were selling marijuana near her house. She let them know that what they were doing was simply unacceptable and dangerous for her as the property owner. Consequently, she told them to take their drugs elsewhere. Additionally, after this episode, Sean gave an ultimatum to the house occupants. Everyone had to get a job or leave the apartment. Far from making the group reflect, as was her intention, what it achieved was that they formed an alliance to show indignation towards her. They decided to leave the apartment and go to a nearby hotel for 2 weeks. But that was not the solution either, because without having an income, after those weeks they had no means to sustain the hotel payment. The need for money did not make them consider working decently. The first idea they had was to return to Kansas, perhaps because it was familiar territory for Tony in terms of drug dealing. After almost a day on the road, the group decided to stop in Arizona and spend the night at a hotel. It was there that Tony told his travel companions that he had come up with an idea, which was to end the lives of his adoptive parents to claim the inheritance. Once they arrived in Wichita and found accommodation at a hotel they rented for a month, they dedicated themselves to refining the details of that idea. It was a simple solution. They had to end the lives of Roger and Melissa, claim the insurance, sell the assets, and use the resources to start a new, larger-scale drug business. Tony was convinced that the original family, which he had returned to, would become rich by cultivating and selling marijuana. Tony even proposed a perfect day to carry out the crime. It would be Friday, November 15th of that year, 2013, as his brother Chris would not be at home, as he had to attend an event related to his wrestling practice. Tony had been a star in that discipline and still maintained contact with some team members, which is how he learned about his brother's commitment that night. Gradually, the plan was formed, in which Tony would communicate with Roger and Melissa and invite them somewhere with the excuse of talking about what had happened between them and try to fix things. Tony's idea was that, while there was no one at home, Braden would take Keisha to the residence so she could enter and steal some valuables. Tony also knew where his adoptive parents kept a significant amount of money for emergencies. The idea was that the act would appear to be a robbery gone wrong. But from the beginning, the final intention was clear. When Roger and Melissa returned home, Keisha would end their lives. Everyone thought it was an excellent plan, but later, Braden backed out. He did not want to participate in the act, but agreed to help by acquiring the guns they would need. As a substitute, he recommended a friend of his, also a former high school peer named Andrew, who could take on the role as the driver to take Keisha to the Blumels' residence. As promised, Braden procured 2 pistols purchased from other criminals. It should be mentioned that there was never any intention to share the money with Andrew, who was agreed to be paid $1,000 to act essentially as a driver and support for Keisha in the robbery. In the end, she would be the executor. In early November, Keisha posted on her social networks a photo of her with Tony and a caption that read, "A bond that cannot be broken." Finally, the day arrived. It was Friday, November 15th, 2013, and as Tony had predicted, his wonderful adoptive parents did not refuse to meet with him. The meeting went peacefully. While at the Blumels' house, the scene was completely different. As soon as Roger and Melissa left for the meeting, Keisha and Andrew entered the house, forced the garage door, and began to rummage through everything. They took the opportunity to take some small, valuable items and the cash the couple kept in the house for any eventuality. Once the first part of the plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew hid beside the secluded residence to wait for their victims to arrive. They soon received a call from Tony, informing them that the meeting had ended, that his adoptive parents had dropped him off at the hotel, and they were on their way home. The wait was not too long. As soon as the Blumels' vehicle stopped in front of the parking gate, the two attackers came out of their hiding place. Keisha immediately positioned herself on Melissa's side, while Andrew aimed at Roger to keep him still. Melissa, still surprised, recognized the mother of the children they had adopted more than 10 years ago to provide love, stability, and a better future. She only managed to say, "Oh my God, Keisha," when a precise shot to the head made her collapse in the seat. Roger, completely disconcerted, tried to assist his wife. Meanwhile, Keisha reached the man's window and pulled the trigger towards Roger's head, but the gun jammed. The woman made several attempts to shoot while he was frozen, with the slumped body of his wife next to him. Finally, the gun fired, and Roger also collapsed next to the one who had been the best partner for his life project. Once the fatal plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew boarded the vehicle they had arrived in and quickly left. The Blumel spouses remained there until around 9:15 p.m., when Chris returned from his meeting and found the terrible scene. He immediately called 911, reporting that he had just arrived home and found his parents practically unconscious inside their van. The young man stated that Roger was coughing and that Melissa was bobbing her head up and down. Both had gunshot marks on their heads. The dispatcher instructed him to try resuscitation maneuvers while emergency services arrived a few minutes later and took over the situation. Miraculously, the Blumels were still alive, but their lives were hanging by a thread, so they were immediately transported to a hospital. While all this was happening, upon returning to the hotel where they were staying, Keisha seemed to have a panic attack and stated that all she needed was to consume some illicit substance, and she did so accompanied by the other boys. Also, at that moment, Keisha handed over the used gun and a wallet of Melissa's that she had stolen from the house to be disposed of in a nearby stream. Andrew threw the items into the pond of a nearby park. The following day, Tony began using the money stolen from his adoptive parents' home to start trafficking marijuana, earning his first $100. Unfortunately, that same day, Melissa lost her battle and passed away at the age of 53. Tony also went to the hospital to see his father, but what he did not know is that sometime before, he had been removed from both the Blumels' will and their insurance policies. Consequently, the two heinous crimes had been committed in vain. In the following days, it was also discovered that Andrew had not been paid and was even unaware that Keisha had taken cash from the Blumel family's home. Eventually, fate caught up with them. In the initial inspections of the Blumel residence, the police noticed that the garage door had been forced open, and inside the home everything was in disarray. There were items scattered everywhere. It was confirmed that money, jewelry, and other items had been stolen. The authorities wondered if the attack on the spouses had been a result of them arriving while the thieves were still in the house. However, the fatal assault had occurred before the couple entered the home, so this initial hypothesis was dismissed. In the van where Roger and Melissa were attacked, there were no significant fingerprints, although investigators did find a bullet casing. Then, the authorities turned their attention towards the victims' workplaces, thinking perhaps an upset client had sought revenge. But this theory was also discarded, so it was time to talk to people close to the couple. The first on the detectives' list was Tony, as he had been the last person seen alive with the victims. But the young man insisted he knew nothing and had not participated in the act. According to him, after finishing dinner, he had gone straight back to the hotel where he was staying with his mother. This information was confirmed by the staff at the tolls. The second on the list was Chris, who had found the bodies, but he was quickly dismissed after verifying his statement that, at the time of the incident, he was at a dinner with members of the wrestling team. However, the investigators found something strange in the young man's behavior. He didn't seem overly disturbed and instead appeared to be lost in thought. When the police pursued this direction and asked him what he thought had happened to his parents, Chris immediately replied that there was only one person who came to mind. He added that the only one who might hold any grudge against their parents, and perhaps be capable of such an act, was his older brother, Tony. With this significant lead, the authorities got a lucky break in their search for the culprits. A man contacted the police to say that a young man who was a friend of Tony had approached him intending to buy a gun. The detectives focused on this individual, and upon checking his background found he had a long history related to drugs. Moreover, they discovered he had traveled to California along with Tony. It was Braden. Sooner rather than later, Braden received a message from his family informing him that the sheriff's office investigators were looking to interrogate him about what had happened to the Blumels. The morning after receiving this information, Braden went to the police station. A press report states that on his way to the police station, he stopped by a pond to throw away something, apparently the guns used in the crime, which had not been disposed of as planned. According to this account, he was already under surveillance, and when the police searched the water, they found in the bag he threw a pistol that had not been fired in the attack. Braden's interrogation lasted for 3 days. At first, the young man maintained he had nothing to do with the incident, but he couldn't withstand the pressure from the authorities and ended up confessing everything he knew, stating that the idea for the attack had been Tony's. Tony Blumel, 18 years old, and his biological mother, Keisha, 35, were arrested on November 19th at the hotel where they were staying. Additionally, Andrew, then 18 years old, was arrested. And finally, Braden, also 18, was put behind bars on November 20th of that same year, 2013. At that time, Keisha did not admit her participation in the robbery and other crimes, although the 3 young men confessed what had happened. On November 25, 2013, the accused made their first appearance before the court via video conference. On that occasion, they were all charged with the same offenses: first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated robbery, burglary, and theft. The 3 young men were set a bail of $500,000, and for Keisha, the bail was set at $1 million. On December 21st, Roger's heart stopped beating, and at 48 years old, he joined his beloved Melissa. And after Roger's death, the situation for the woman and the 3 young men worsened, as they could be charged with capital murder, which could imply a death penalty sentence. Indeed, on January 3, 2014, The 4 detainees were formally charged with a count of capital murder for being the alleged perpetrators of the death of more than one person in the same incident. Additionally, Keisha was charged with 2 counts of aggravated robbery, 1 count of burglary, and 1 count of theft. The preliminary hearing took place on July 17th of that same year. By that time, Braden had negotiated with the authorities, and in exchange for a benefit in his sentence, he ended up becoming the prosecution's star witness. After a year of negotiations, not only did Braden reach an agreement, but 2 other individuals involved in the crime also negotiated with the prosecution. According to the agreements reached, the accused would not dispute the charges against them and would waive their right to appeal their sentences. In exchange, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty and to drop some charges. Starting in mid-2015, in separate hearings, each confirmed their decision to plead guilty. The judge sentenced Keisha to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the capital murder charge, and additionally to 122 months in prison for 2 counts of aggravated robbery. The sentences would be served consecutively. In her opportunity to speak, she stated she deeply regretted what had happened and lamented everything the Blumel family had to go through. The rest of her statement was controversial, as she claimed she had nothing to do with the incident, having no anger towards the Blumels. On the contrary, she had the utmost respect for them, as they had given Tony and Chris a wonderful life, and she would always be grateful for that. According to official records to this day, Keisha remains detained in a high-security-level correctional facility. The second to face his fate was her son, Anthony Blumel, known to everyone as Tony, who received the same sentence as his mother. During the sentencing hearing, Tony, who declined to speak when given the opportunity, heard the victim impact statement made by his aunt, Christina Blumel, who thanked the authorities for administering justice and referred to all the love that Roger and Melissa had given the boy. In complete silence, Tony listened to Christina's heartfelt words, and at one moment, tears almost sprang from the young criminal's eyes. In the end, the woman told Tony that he had chosen his path without anyone forcing him to make those decisions. She added that perhaps one day he might understand his choices, or perhaps he never would. Tony has been since then in a correctional facility. His record up to this moment listed a significant number of prison infractions related to smuggling, fights, unauthorized phone use, explicit sex, theft, and disobedience, among others. A week after these sentences, it was Andrew's turn, the only one who did not agree to acknowledge his responsibility and was found guilty of first and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, plus 155 months. Finally, Braden, the last of the participants in the incident and who from the beginning had reached an agreement with the prosecution, was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 24.5 years in prison. According to his official record, his first opportunity for release will be on May 28, 2035. However, his prison record shows that far from reforming, Braden had received 71 disciplinary reports for disobedience, threats to others, stimulant use, intoxication, possession of tobacco contraband, theft, and dangerous smuggling, among other causes. In the end, the district attorney expressed satisfaction with the outcome of this case. It's worth noting that even though she had waived that right, Keisha attempted to appeal her sentences unsuccessfully. At the end of this story, only one thing remains undisputed. The lives of 2 wonderful people, Roger and Melissa Blumel, were cut short with a terrible and unnecessary ending. The bitterness, or perhaps the guilt of a woman who led a life of excess for which she gave up her children for adoption, was the genesis of the tragedy. She couldn't bear that one of her descendants wanted nothing more to do with her, which apparently led her to direct her anger at the people who gave all their love and well-being to her children. For his part, Tony repaid all the love and care received from that couple with resentment, envy, and violence, resorting to an unjustifiable path of substance abuse, and finally, a double crime. Keisha's younger daughter ended up being sent to a foster home. As for Chris Blumel, he managed to overcome what happened and has led a good life with the support of the family. And well, dear audience, that concludes today's case. Before you go, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to share this video if you think someone you know might be interested. See you in another episode of Unreal True Crime. Goodbye.